Come close now, children of the quarters, grandchildren of them that survived. Sit yourself down on this hard ground and let me tell you about Annie of the firebox, a woman who spent 80 days being cooked slow in an iron coffin under the Alabama sun, and still she breathed when they thought her dead. This ain't no tale from white folks' books. This is memory passed mouth to mouth in the slave quarters when the moon hung heavy and the overseer slept. This is truth that the cotton fields still whisper. Annie's story gonna shake your soul, gonna make you understand what it cost to keep breathing when the devil himself wanted you buried. Lord have mercy on what I'm about to tell. Now listen here, child, 'cause everything starts somewhere, and Annie's story starts way back across that dark water, in the belly of a slave ship where souls was packed tight as cotton bales. Her grandmother, they called her Nana Ephua, though that wasn't the name the white folks gave her. She came from the Gold Coast, from a land where the drums spoke language and the ancestors walked close. Nana Ephua was stolen young, maybe 15 summers, stolen right from her village when the raiders came at dawn. They bound her with iron, marched her to the coast, and sold her to Portuguese traders who looked at her strong back and wide hips like she was breeding stock. Lord of glory, what they did to our people. The Middle Passage, folks, that's what they called that journey through hell. Nana Ephua spent 2 months chained in darkness, lying in her own filth, listening to the moaning and the praying in languages that was slowly dying. The stench was suffering so bad that even the white sailors couldn't stand topside without covering their faces. Every day somebody died, from fever, from heartbreak, from giving up. The bodies got thrown overboard, fed to the sharks that followed the ship like death's own escort. But Nana Ephua, she held on. Deep in that darkness, she sang the songs her mama taught her, songs to the Orishas, songs that carried power. The other women in the hold, they joined in, and for a moment, just a moment, they wasn't cargo. They was still human, still African, still free in they spirits. When the ship docked in Charleston, South Carolina, they dragged Nana Ephua and the other survivors onto the auction block. She stood there naked, barely covering herself, while white men poked at her teeth, squeezed her arms, examined her like she was a horse. The auctioneer shouted numbers, and a plantation owner from Alabama, man named Harlan Wexford, cold-eyed devil with a reputation for cruelty, he bought her for $300, 300 pieces of silver for a human soul. Jesus wept. They branded her with the Wexford mark, and W burned into her shoulder with hot iron, and the smell of her own flesh cooking stayed with her till she died. Wexford Plantation sat in the heart of the Black Belt, where the soil was dark as night and rich with the blood and sweat of stolen people. Cotton fields stretched far as the eye could see, rows and rows of white bowls that looked pretty from a distance, but cost everything to pick. The big house sat on a hill, all white columns and wide verandas where Massa Wexford and his kin sipped mint julep and talked about states' rights while we broke our backs below. The slave quarters was a mess of wooden cabins, barely standing, with dirt floors and roofs that leaked when it rained. 50, 60 people crowded into them shacks, families split up, children sleeping on rags, old folks dying slow from working past their time. Nana Ephua learned quick that this new world had its own rules, and breaking them meant the whipping post. The overseer, a man named Gideon Hale, folks called him Hale the Hellbringer, he carried a leather whip and used it free. He'd whip you for working slow, for looking at him wrong, for singing too loud in the fields. But Nana Ephua, she was stubborn as iron. She kept her African ways secret, hiding them deep. At night in the quarters, she'd gather the women and teach them what she remembered. How to call on the ancestors, how to read signs in nature, how to make medicine from roots and herbs. She became what folks later called a root doctor, a conjure woman. White folks didn't understand it, thought it was superstition, but we knew better. Them roots had power. That knowledge kept us alive. Years passed, and Nana Ephua had children, 3 daughters, all by different men, some by choice, some not. Slavery didn't give you the luxury of protecting your body. One of them daughters was named Keturah, and she grew up strong-willed like her mama, with the same fire in her eyes. Keturah learned everything Nana Ephua taught her. The prayers, the herbs, the conjure. She learned how to hide rebellion in a smile, how to slow work without getting caught, how to survive. And when Keturah grew into a woman, she met a man named Solomon, a field hand from a neighboring plantation. They jumped the broom in secret, under a moonless sky, with Nana Ephua speaking the words that bound them. It wasn't legal in white folks' eyes, but it was real to us. And that's what mattered. Keturah got pregnant and the whole quarters waited hoping for a healthy child. In them days, having a baby was dangerous. So many didn't make it. And if they did, there was always the fear that the master would sell them off soon as they was old enough to work or to breed. But Keturah carried that baby with determination, working the fields right up until the pain started. When her time came, it was a hot September night, the kind where the air sits heavy and even the crickets sound tired. Nana Ephua attended the birth, along with 2 other old women who knew the ways. They laid Keturah on a pallet in the cabin, and she labored for hours, sweating and praying. The baby came just before dawn, under a sky turning purple and gold. It was a girl, and Lord, she came out crying strong, fists clenched tight like she was ready to fight the world already. Nana Ephua held her up, looked into them dark eyes, and saw something that made her pause. She saw strength, yeah, but she also saw sorrow ahead. She wrapped the baby in a scrap of cloth and whispered a prayer in her old language, begging the ancestors to watch over this child. They named her Annie, after no one in particular, just a name that felt right, a name that could carry weight. Annie's first cries echoed through the quarters and folks came out to see. There was joy, brief and fragile, because new life is always hope, even in bondage. But there was also fear, because everybody knew what kind of world Annie was born into. Outside the cabin, the sun was rising over the cotton fields, and already you could hear the overseer's voice shouting, "Get up, time to work." The whip cracked in the distance, a sound that never stopped, that wove itself into the rhythm of plantation life like a heartbeat made of pain. Nana Ephua stood at the cabin door, holding baby Annie, and looked out at that sun. She thought about the journey she'd made, the ocean she'd crossed in chains, the homeland she'd never see again. She thought about her daughter Keturah, exhausted but alive on the pallet behind her. And she thought about this new granddaughter, this Annie, who just entered a world determined to break her. But Nana Ephua made a promise right then, silent and fierce. She promised the ancestors that she'd teach this girl everything, the songs, the roots, the conjure, the resistance. She'd make sure Annie knew where she came from, even if she never saw Africa. She'd plant that seed deep, so deep that no master, no overseer, no whip could dig it out. "You gonna be strong, child," Nana Ephua whispered to baby Annie, rocking her gentle. "Stronger than they think. You got the blood of warriors, the spirit of them that crossed the water and didn't break. This world gonna try to kill you slow, but you hold on. You hear me? You hold on." And maybe baby Annie heard, or maybe it was just the wind. But in that moment she stopped crying and looked up at her great-grandmother with eyes too old for a newborn. Outside, the overseer's voice got closer, and the day's suffering was about to begin. But in that cabin, for just a heartbeat, there was peace. There was family. There was the seed of something that couldn't be chained. Memory, resistance, love stronger than iron. That seed was planted, and it would grow into Annie of the firebox, the woman who'd survive 80 days of hell, and teach us all what it means to refuse to die. Annie grew fast, the way plantation children did when there wasn't time for childhood. By the time she was 5 summers old, she was already in the cotton fields dragging a sack half her size, her small fingers learning to pick without touching the sharp bowls that cut skin easy. Massa Wexford didn't believe in letting young ones rest. If you could walk, you could work. Lord have mercy on how they treated us. The sun beat down fierce in them Alabama fields, turning the red clay to dust that got in your eyes, your mouth, your lungs. Annie worked beside her mama Keturah and the other women, learning the songs they sang to keep rhythm. Work songs that sounded like praying and sometimes was. "Keep your back bent, child," Keturah would whisper when the overseer wasn't close. Don't never look him in the eye. Don't give him reason. Annie learned quick that Gideon Hale, that hellbringer with the whip, he was always watching, always waiting for somebody to slow down or stand up straight or show any sign of being human instead of mule. She saw him use that whip more times than she could count, saw the leather cut through shirts and skin alike, saw grown men brought to their knees. The sound of it, that crack sharp as thunder, it became the soundtrack of her childhood along with the moaning that came after. By the time Annie was 7, she'd already been whipped twice. First time was for spilling water she was carrying to the field hands. Her little legs gave out, the bucket tipped, and Hale saw. He didn't care that she was just a child, that she was suffering from heat and thirst herself. He grabbed her by the arm, dragged her to a tree, and gave her 5 lashes across her back. Annie screamed, but she didn't cry, not where he could see. Nana Ephua tended her that night, washing the wounds with a brew made from herbs, singing low in her African tongue, calling on the ancestors to give the child strength. "They gonna try to break you, baby," the old woman said, her voice heavy with knowing. "But you got iron in your blood. You remember that." The second whipping came a year later, when Annie was caught teaching herself letters from a scrap of newspaper she found blowing across the yard. Reading was forbidden, you see. White folks knew that knowledge was power, and they couldn't have us powerful. The overseer caught her staring at them marks, sounding out words under her breath, and he flew into a rage. This time it was 10 lashes, and they left scars that Annie would carry for life, raised lines across her shoulders like a road map of cruelty. But even after that, she kept learning, kept watching, kept remembering. Rebellious soul, that's what she was. Defiant one. Life in the quarters was hard beyond description. The cabins was cramped, dark, cold in winter, and stiflingly hot in summer. Families slept on pallets made of rags, sometimes 6 or 7 people in a space barely big enough for 2. Food was scarce, mostly cornmeal, a little salt pork if you was lucky, greens from whatever you could grow in the tiny plots behind the cabins. Children went to bed hungry more often than not, bellies aching, while up in the big house the white folks feasted on ham and biscuits and pie. Annie learned to ignore the hunger, to focus on other things. The stories Nana Ephua told about Africa, the songs her mama taught her, the secret gatherings in the hush harbors deep in the woods where folks worshipped the way they needed to, not the way the master demanded. Them hush harbors was sacred spaces, hidden clearings where the enslaved could pray without being watched, could sing spirituals that spoke of freedom in coded words, could let they souls breathe. Annie went with her mama and Nana Ephua, sneaking out after dark when the paddy rollers wasn't watching close. They'd gather under the trees, maybe 20 or 30 folks, and somebody would lead a ring shout. That old African dance where you moved in a circle, feet shuffling, bodies swaying, voices rising in songs that called on powers older than slavery. Annie felt something in them moments, something she couldn't name but knew was real. It was like the ancestors came close, whispering, "Hold on, we see you, you ain't forgot." But danger was always near. The paddy rollers, white men who rode at night, hunting for runaways and breaking up slave gatherings, they was vicious. If they caught you in the woods without a pass, they'd beat you half to death or worse, drag you back to the master for punishment. Annie saw it happen to a man named Silas, who got caught returning from a hush harbor meeting. They tied him to the whipping post and gave him 50 lashes, and he never walked right again. Fear lived in the quarters like a fourth wall, always present, always pressing down. When Annie was 10, she started noticing changes on the plantation that scared her more than the whip. Young Massa, that's what they called him, though his name was Randall Wexford, son of Old Harlan. He was growing into a man, and he had his daddy's cruelty but with a different flavor. Where Old Harlan was cold and businesslike in his evil, Randall enjoyed it. He'd walk through the quarters with a smirk, eyes roaming over the women and girls in a way that made everybody's skin crawl. Annie's mama started keeping her close, made her wear shapeless dresses, told her to stay dirty, stay unnoticed. "That boy got devil eyes," Keturah whispered one night. "You stay away from him, you hear?" Annie heard, but staying away wasn't always possible on a plantation where the white folks controlled every minute of your day. She started seeing things, young Massa pulling girls into the barn, emerging later with his clothes adjusted and them crying. She heard whispers about Patsy, a girl just 14 who got heavy with his child and then disappeared, sold off before the baby showed too much. These was the particular horrors saved for women and girls in slavery. The violations that happened in shadows but everybody knew about. Annie started having nightmares, waking up in the dark cabin with her heart pounding, her mama's hand on her forehead, shaving her back to sleep. It was around this time that Nana Ephua started teaching Annie the deeper conjure, the protective work. The old woman was failing by then, her body bent from years of field work and ocean crossing, but her mind was sharp as iron. She took Annie into the woods one evening, to a spot where 3 paths crossed, a crossroads, powerful place in the old ways. "Listen good, child," Nana said, digging in the red clay with her gnarled fingers. "This earth, it hold power. The ancestors live in it. You learn to call on them when trouble come." She taught Annie how to make a mojo bag, a small pouch filled with roots, graveyard dirt, a piece of silver, and a lock of her own hair, sewn up with red thread and prayers. "You keep this close," Nana said, pressing it into Annie's hand. "It gonna protect you from evil, turn away bad intentions. But remember, conjure ain't magic for lazy folks. It work, when you fight, when you don't give up." Annie wore that mojo bag around her neck, hidden under her clothes, and it became like a second heartbeat. She started paying more attention to the natural world, the way birds warned of danger, the way the moon's phases affected people's moods, the way certain plants could heal or harm. She learned which roots to dig for fever, which leaves made a poultice for wounds, which barks, when brewed, could bring sleep or even stop a pregnancy if needed. This was knowledge passed down from Africa, adapted to survive in this new cruel land, and Annie drank it in like water. But childhood, even a stolen one, couldn't last forever. The world was changing around the plantation. News came through the grapevine, that secret network of communication between enslaved folks, about revolts in other states, about Nat Turner and his vision-driven rebellion in Virginia, about the Underground Railroad helping people escape north. These stories lit fires in young hearts, Annie's included, even as they brought harsher crackdowns from fearful masters. Old Harlan Wexford got meaner, hired more overseers, increased patrols. The quarters lived under a cloud of tension, everybody knowing that freedom was possible somewhere but feeling trapped, like birds with clipped wings. Then, one autumn day when Annie was 12, everything shifted. Young Massa Randall, now 18 and full of himself, returned from a trip to Atlanta with new ideas about running the plantation. He wanted to modernize, which meant pushing the enslaved even harder, cutting rations, increasing quotas. He also wanted to assert his authority, and he did it by example. Annie was in the fields when she heard the commotion, shouts, cries, the sound of a struggle. She looked up and saw Randall dragging a woman named Zilpha toward the barn. Zilpha resisting, screaming, other folks frozen in fear because what could they do? The overseer stood by, watching, making sure no one interfered. Annie's blood ran cold. She looked at her mama, at the other women, and saw the resignation in their eyes, the knowledge that this was just how it was, that they was powerless. But something in Annie broke right then, or maybe it hardened. She thought about Nana Efua's words, "You got iron in your blood." She thought about the ancestors who survived the Middle Passage. She thought about Nat Turner, about Denmark Vesey, about every soul who'd chosen resistance over submission. And she made a vow, silent and fierce, standing there in the cotton field with the sun beating down and the bowl scratching her hands. "When I'm grown, I ain't bending. Not for him, not for nobody." That night, Nana Ephua died. She went peaceful in her sleep, just slipped away like she'd been waiting for something, and finally saw it. The quarters mourned her in the way we could, quiet, dignified, with songs sung low and prayers whispered. Annie stood over the old woman's body, looking at the face that held so much knowledge, so much pain, so much strength. and she felt the weight of inheritance settle on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. Kedura put a hand on her daughter's head and said, "She passed it to you, baby. All that knowing, all that power. You the root carrier now." Annie was 12 years old, still a child in so many ways. But from that day on, she started growing into something else. Into a woman who'd be tested by fire, literally, and who'd teach us all that the spirit can endure what the body cannot. The seed Nana Ephua planted was taking root, pushing up through the hard soil of slavery, reaching toward a light that seemed impossible but was coming, slow and certain as dawn. And young Massa Randall? He walked the plantation now with a swagger, thinking himself untouchable, not knowing that the girl in the fields, the one with scars on her back and a mojo bag around her neck, would one day stand between him and what he wanted and refuse to move. The collision was coming. Sure as cotton blooms white, sure as blood soaks into red clay, sure as the ancestors was watching, waiting, remembering every single crime. Annie turned 16 in the spring of 1846, and Lord have mercy, she'd grown into a woman despite everything trying to keep her small. She was tall, strong-backed, with her great-grandmother's fire burning in her eyes, and her mama's determination set in her jaw. The work had hardened her body, but not her spirit. If anything, the spirit burned brighter, hotter, like coals that refused to go cold. She carried Nana Ephua's knowledge in her bones now, knew which roots to dig by moonlight, which prayers to whisper at crossroads, which signs meant danger coming. The other folks in the quarters started looking to her the way they'd looked to the old woman, seeking remedies, seeking hope. It was at a secret ring shout, deep in the woods past the cotton fields, that Annie first truly saw Josiah. Oh, she'd known him before. Everybody knew everybody in the quarters. But that night was different. The gathering was hidden in a hollow where the cypress trees grew thick and the Spanish moss hung like curtains, muffling sound. Maybe 30 souls had snuck away from their cabins, risking the paddy rollers' wrath to worship the way they needed. Somebody was leading a spiritual, voices rising and falling like waves, and folks was moving in the old circle dance, feet shuffling, hands clapping, bodies swaying in rhythm older than slavery itself. Josiah stood across the circle from Annie, and when their eyes met through the firelight and shadows, something shifted in the air. He was a field hand from the eastern section of Wexford Plantation, strong as oak, with hands that had picked 1,000,000 pounds of cotton and a back that carried scars like medals of survival. But his eyes, Jesus wept. His eyes was gentle, full of something that hadn't been beaten out of him yet. When the ring shout ended and folks scattered to avoid being caught, Josiah walked over to Annie, slow and purposeful. "You Ketura's daughter," he said, voice deep and quiet. "The one they say got the old knowing." Annie nodded, suddenly shy in a way she wasn't used to. "And you Solomon's nephew," she replied, remembering the family connections that webbed through the quarters like roots underground. They talked that night, standing at the edge of the clearing while others drifted away. Talked about small things and big things. About the cotton harvest. About the rumors of more runaways heading north. About whether God really heard prayers from enslaved folks, or if heaven was another white man's lie. Josiah made Annie laugh, something that happened rare in them days. And when he reached out tentative and touched her hand, she didn't pull away. "I been watching you," Josiah admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Seeing how you carry yourself, strong-willed woman that you are. Seeing how you don't break. We all break sometimes," Annie said, thinking of the nights she cried quiet into her pallet, thinking of the scars on her back. "Maybe," Josiah said, "but you put yourself back together. That's what matters." From that night on, they found ways to see each other. Stolen moments between work, quick conversations at the well, glances across the fields that said more than words could. It was dangerous, this thing growing between them, because love in slavery was always shadowed by the knowledge that it could be ripped apart at any moment. Masters didn't care about hearts when they sold folks south or split families to settle debts. But Annie and Josiah let themselves hope anyway, let themselves feel anyway, because what else was there? 6 months later, On a warm autumn evening when the harvest moon hung fat and orange in the sky, they jumped the broom. It wasn't legal in white folks' eyes. Enslaved people couldn't legally marry. But it was real to them, and that's what counted. Keturah performed the ceremony in a hidden spot by the creek, speaking words passed down from Nana Ephua, blessing the union with prayers in English and fragments of African languages that nobody remembered the full meaning of, but knew was sacred. Annie and Josiah held hands and jumped over a broom laid on the ground, landing together on the other side as husband and wife. "Whatever come," Josiah said, holding Annie close under the stars, "we face it together. You hear me? Together." Annie nodded against his chest, feeling his heartbeat steady and strong. For the first time in her life, she felt something close to peace, something close to wholeness. But even in that moment of joy, she felt the shadow, the sense that this happiness was temporary, that trials was coming that would test them beyond enduring. She thought about her mojo bag, about the ancestors watching, about the promises she'd made to herself. And she held Josiah tighter, knowing that love in bondage was the bravest act of resistance there was. Up in the big house, young Massa Randall was planning his own future, talking with his daddy about expanding operations, about buying more land and more bodies to work it. And sometimes, when he walked through the quarters, his eyes lingered on the young women, including Annie, with intentions that made her skin crawl. But tonight was hers and Josiah's. Tonight they was husband and wife, and not even slavery could take that truth away from them. Not yet. Listen here now, 'cause this part gonna hurt your heart and fill it at the same time. Within a year of jumping the broom, Annie's belly started to swell with life, and the quarters buzzed with careful joy. Having babies in slavery was complicated. It meant more souls for the master to own, more bodies for the auction block. But it also meant continuity, meant that despite everything, we was still here, still surviving, still creating life in the face of death. Keturah attended Annie through the pregnancy, brewing teas from raspberry leaf and ginger root, rubbing her daughter's swollen feet after long days in the fields. Yes, pregnant women still worked. Massa didn't care if you was carrying or not. You picked cotton till the pain started. The first child came on a February morning, cold and gray, with frost still on the ground. Annie labored hard, 14 hours of pain that felt like her body was being torn apart. But when the baby finally emerged, a boy, healthy and strong, the agony transformed into something else. Josiah wept when he held his son, this tiny, perfect thing with fingers like flower petals and a cry that announced he was alive. He was real. He was theirs. They named him Samuel, after nobody in particular, just a name that sounded like strength. Old folks came to see, bringing small gifts. A carved wooden rattle, a blanket stitched from scraps, a blessing whispered in African-tinged words. But joy on a plantation was always tempered by fear. 3 days after Samuel was born, the overseer came to the cabin with the birth register, writing down the child's name in Massa's ledger. That's when it hit Annie full force. This baby wasn't really hers. He belonged to Wexford, same as she did, same as Josiah did. He could be sold away at any time, for any reason or no reason at all. That knowledge sat in her chest like a stone, heavy and cold. Still, Annie poured all her love into Samuel. She sang him spirituals while she worked, carrying him on her back in a cloth wrap the way African women had done for generations. She nursed him in stolen moments between cotton rows, shielding him from the sun with her own body. And when he started walking, started talking, started becoming a little person with his own thoughts and ways, her love grew fiercer, more protective. Josiah was a devoted father, playing with Samuel in the evenings after work, teaching him little things, how to skip stones in the creek, how to recognize different bird calls, how to be strong and gentle at the same time. 2 years later, Annie had another child, a daughter this time born easier than Samuel, as if the body remembered what to do. They named her Sarah, and Lord, that girl was beautiful even as a newborn, with big dark eyes that seemed to see everything. Then came 2 more sons in quick succession, Benjamin and Moses, both healthy, both loud, both full of life that couldn't be contained. 4 children in 6 years. 4 perilous negras, black pearls running through the quarters, laughing despite everything, playing games with other children, not yet understanding the weight of the chains they was born into. Annie's cabin became a place of warmth in the midst of darkness. She told her children stories at night, stories about Africa that Nana Ephua had told her, stories about clever rabbits outwitting foxes, really stories about enslaved folks outwitting masters, stories about a far-off land called freedom where nobody owned nobody else. She taught them to be careful, to watch they mouths around white folks, to never show anger or pride where it could be seen. But in the privacy of they cabin, she also taught them to remember they was human. They was loved. They was more than what Massa's ledger said. Josiah worked himself near to death to keep his family fed, taking extra tasks, hiding small amounts of food from the communal pot, trapping rabbits and possums in the woods to supplement the meager rations. Annie sewed clothes from scraps, grew vegetables in the tiny plot behind they cabin, used her root knowledge to keep the children healthy when sickness swept through the quarters. They built a life, fragile and precious, in the shadow of bondage. But shadows was growing longer. Young Massa Randall, now married himself to a pale, delicate woman from Savannah, was taking more control of the plantation as his daddy aged, and Randall's eyes had started noticing the children in the quarters, especially the girls as they grew. When Sarah turned 10, starting to show the first signs of becoming a young woman, Annie saw the way Randall looked at her daughter, and a cold dread settled in her bones. She started keeping Sarah close, dressing her in shapeless clothes, rubbing dirt on her face to make her less noticeable. But you can't hide beauty born from within, and Sarah had her mama's strength, her great-great-grandmother's fire, and something else, a light that drew eyes whether she wanted it or not. The collision was coming. Annie could feel it in her spirit, in her dreams where Nana Ephua appeared and warned her in words that faded upon waking. She could see it in the way Randall walked through the quarters now, confident, entitled, dangerous. She held her children tighter, prayed harder, worked more conjure. But deep down she knew. The storm was gathering, and it would break soon, violent and terrible, testing everything she thought she knew about survival, about motherhood, about how far a woman would go to protect her young. Now comes the part that makes my old voice shake, that brings tears even after all these years. Sarah turned 13 in the spring of 1865, and she'd grown into something that couldn't be hidden no more. A young woman with her mama's strength and a grace that came from somewhere deep, somewhere the masters couldn't touch. Annie tried everything to protect her, kept her in shapeless dresses, made her work the farthest fields, taught her to walk bent over like she was broken. But Randall Wexford had been watching, waiting like a snake in tall grass. It started subtle, the way evil often does. Randall began calling Sarah up to the big house for tasks, fetching water, helping in the kitchen, carrying firewood. His wife, that pale woman from Savannah who spent most days in bed with vapors and headaches, didn't seem to notice or didn't care. The house servants, they knew what was coming. They'd seen it before with other girls. But what could they do? You couldn't tell Massa no. You couldn't protect your children when the law said they wasn't really yours, said you had no rights a white man was bound to respect. Annie's heart lived in her throat every time Sarah went to that house. She'd send protective prayers with her daughter, had sewn a mojo bag into the hem of Sarah's dress. But conjure can only do so much against the determined cruelty of powerful men. Josiah wanted to do something, anything. But Annie held him back, knowing that if he challenged Randall, he'd be sold away or worse, and then where would they be? "We watch," Annie said, though the words tasted like ash. "We wait. We protect how we can. But protection has limits when you're property." One afternoon, Sarah came back from the big house different. She walked slower, wouldn't meet nobody's eyes, and when Annie pulled her aside in the cabin, the girl broke down crying, something she rarely did. Through the sobs, the story came out. Randall had cornered her in the pantry, put his hands where they had no business being, whispered things in her ear that made her skin crawl. He didn't force himself on her yet, not fully, but the intention was clear as daylight. He said I was pretty, Sarah choked out. Said he liked girls with spirit. Said I should be grateful for his attention. Annie's blood went cold then hot, rage rising up like fire from the earth's core. She held her daughter close, rocking her, whispering fierce promises. He ain't gonna touch you again. I swear on the ancestors, on Nana Ephua's grave, he ain't gonna have you. That night, Annie worked conjure like she never had before. She gathered dirt from a crossroads at midnight, mixed it with red pepper and sulfur, hot foot powder to make Randall's attention turn away. She buried it at the edge of the big house property, speaking words in the old language, calling on powers that predated Christianity, that came from the homeland across the water. She made Sarah a stronger mojo bag, filled with roots that repelled evil intention, and made her promise to never be alone with Randall if she could help it. For a few weeks it seemed to work. Randall called Sarah to the house less often, and when he did, there was always another servant nearby. Annie started to hope, started to think maybe the conjure had turned his attention elsewhere. But she should have known better. Men like Randall don't give up easy when they want something, and Sarah, beautiful, strong-willed Sarah, had caught him in a way that gnawed at his pride. One evening in late June, when the heat hung heavy and the air smelled like coming rain, Sarah was sent to the big house to deliver fresh linens. Annie's instincts screamed danger, but the overseer was watching, and you couldn't refuse a direct order without punishment. Sarah went, mojo bag warm against her skin, prayers on her lips. Annie watched her walk up that hill toward the white columns and the wide verandas, and something in her soul twisted tight. Hours passed. Sarah should have been back by sunset, but darkness fell and she still wasn't home. Annie paced outside the cabin, Josiah beside her, both of them sick with worry but unable to go searching. Enslaved folks couldn't just walk up to the big house demanding answers. The other children felt the tension, huddled inside, quiet, not understanding but knowing something was terribly wrong. When Sarah finally came home, it was near midnight. She stumbled through the door, dress torn at the shoulder, hair pulled loose from its wrap, eyes wide and traumatized. Annie caught her as she collapsed, and the girl sobbed against her mama's chest with sounds that came from somewhere primal, somewhere wounded beyond words. Annie didn't need to ask what happened. She could see it in the bruises on Sarah's arms, in the way the girl couldn't stop shaking, in the particular violation that showed in her eyes. Josiah saw it too, and something broke in him. He started for the door, murder in his heart, but Annie grabbed him. "No," she said, though her own heart was screaming for blood. "They'll hang you. They'll sell our boys. We have to be smart." "Smart?" Josiah's voice cracked. "He hurt our daughter." I know." Annie's own voice rose, then dropped to a fierce whisper. "I know what he'd done, and I swear before God and the ancestors he gonna pay. But not tonight. Not like this." She tended to Sarah with gentle hands and herbs that eased pain, singing low spirituals that had comforted enslaved women through violations for generations. She held her daughter through the night as the girl cried herself into fitful sleep, and in that darkness, Annie made promises. Dangerous promises. Promises that would lead her to the firebox, but she didn't care. Some things was worth any price. The shadow from the big house had fallen on her family, and Annie would make sure it never fell again, even if it meant facing hell itself. 3 days later, Randall called for Sarah again. The summons came through the overseer at midday, casual as anything, like what he'd done wasn't rape, wasn't evil, wasn't a sin that cried out to heaven. Annie heard the order and something inside her snapped clean through. Not broke, but transformed, like iron in the forge turning from soft metal to hard blade. She looked at her daughter, still moving careful from the trauma, eyes haunted, and made a decision that would cost her everything. "She ain't going," Annie said quiet to the overseer. Gideon Hale, that hellbringer with the whip, looked at her like she'd spoken in tongues. "What you say?" "I said she ain't going." Annie's voice was steady, though her heart pounded like African drums. "She's sick. I go instead." The overseer's face darkened. "That ain't your decision to make. Massa wants Sarah. He gets Sarah. Then he gonna have to come through me first." Word spread fast through the quarters. Annie had refused a direct order, had stood up to the overseer. Folks watched from their cabins, fearful and awed at the same time, knowing this wouldn't end well but understanding why she did it. A mama protecting her child. That's something even slavery couldn't fully squash. Keturah tried to intervene, begging Annie to reconsider, but Annie's mind was set like concrete. That evening, Randall himself came down to the quarters, something he rarely did. He walked straight to Annie's cabin, the overseer behind him, and when Annie stepped outside to meet him, the whole quarters held its breath. Randall was smiling, that cruel smile that showed he enjoyed this, enjoyed having power over life and death, over bodies and souls. "I hear you got something to say about my orders," Randall drawled, hands on his hips. Annie stood straight, looked him in the eye. "Something you wasn't supposed to do. Something that could get you whipped just for that. She ain't coming to your house no more," Annie said, voice clear and strong. "You done enough damage." The smile dropped from Randall's face like a mask falling. "You forgetting your place. You and your daughter both belong to me. I can do whatever I please. Not with my child, you can't." Randall's hand moved fast, slapping Annie across the face hard enough to split her lip. She stumbled but didn't fall, didn't cry out, just straightened back up and met his eyes again. Behind her, she heard Josiah moving, heard him being held back by other men who knew that if he interfered, it'd be worse for everybody. Sarah was crying inside the cabin, the boys too, but Annie blocked them from her mind. This moment was hers. "You gonna regret this," Randall said, voice low and dangerous. "I was gonna be gentle with your girl, but now I'm gonna make an example out of you that every slave on this plantation will remember." "Do what you gonna do," Annie said, tasting blood in her mouth. "But you touch my daughter again, and I swear before God and the ancestors, you gonna pay. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but the debt always come due, that's a promise." Randall's face went purple with rage. He grabbed Annie by the throat, slamming her against the cabin wall. She clawed at his hands, instinct taken over, and her nails raked across his cheek, drawing blood. The moment she did it, she knew she'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Randall released her, touching his face, staring at the red on his fingers with something like shock. You struck me." His voice was quiet, deadly. "You drew my blood." The quarters went silent as a grave. Even the crickets seemed to stop chirping. Everybody knew what this meant. An enslaved person attacking a white person, even in self-defense that was punishable by death. Or worse than death. Annie stood there, chest heaving, blood from her split lip dripping down her chin, and waited for whatever was coming. Randall smiled then, slow and terrible. "I was gonna sell you," he said. "But no, that's too easy. You need to learn respect, and everybody here needs to see what happens to rebellious property." He turned to the overseer. "Get the men. Build the box. The biggest one." Annie's blood turned to ice. She'd heard stories about punishment boxes, iron cages left in the sun where folks was locked for days, sometimes weeks, cooking slow in the heat till they broke or died. But she'd never seen one on Wexford Plantation. Never imagined she'd be the one. "No!" Sarah burst from the cabin, throwing herself at Randall's feet. "Please, massa. Please don't hurt my mama. I'll come, I'll do whatever you want, just please." Annie grabbed her daughter, pulling her back. "Hush now," she said fierce, holding Sarah close. "This ain't your burden. You stay strong. You hear me? You stay strong and you protect your brothers. I'll be all right." She was lying, and they both knew it, but sometimes lies is all the comfort we got. The overseer's men came, rough hands gripping Annie's arms, dragging her away from her family. She heard Josiah's voice breaking, heard her children crying, heard Keturah praying loud in the old language. She heard all of it as they pulled her toward the punishment area, where the carpenter was already unloading tools, where the blacksmith was firing up his forge to make the special lock that would seal her in. Annie looked back once, saw her family clustered together in the doorway of their cabin, saw Sarah holding her little brothers, saw Josiah with tears streaming down his face. She locked eyes with him across the distance and mouthed words, "I love you. Take care of them." Then she turned forward, lifted her chin, and walked toward her punishment with the dignity of someone who'd chosen this, who'd decided that protecting her child was worth whatever hell awaited. The ancestors was watching. Nana Ephua's spirit was near. She could feel it. And somewhere in her chest, that seed of resistance that had been planted so long ago was bearing its bitter, necessary fruit. The firebox was coming. 80 days of hell was waiting. But Annie had made her choice, had drawn her line, had shown her daughter and her sons that some things, love, dignity, protection of the weak, some things was worth dying for. And if she survived, Lord, if she survived, the whole world would know that you can torture a body, but you can't kill a spirit that refuses to break. Now listen close, 'cause this part gonna chill your bones even on the hottest day. The blacksmith on Wexford Plantation was a man named Solomon, not Annie's husband's uncle, but another Solomon, older, bent from years at the forge. He'd made horseshoes and plow blades and chains his whole life, but never nothing like what Randall ordered him to build that night. The young massa stood in the smithy, drawing plans in the dirt with a stick, describing dimensions that made Solomon's hands shake. 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, 2 feet tall, Randall said, voice cold as winter. Thick iron, ventilation holes small as your finger. A box that'll hold a grown woman but won't let her stand, won't let her stretch out proper. And I want it ready by dawn. Solomon looked at the plans and saw a coffin, saw a torture device worse than the whipping post because it would work slow, would break the spirit through days and weeks of suffering. He opened his mouth to protest, then closed it. What could he say? He was property too, and refusing would get him the same fate or worse. So he fired up his forge, the flames leaping high and angry, and started hammering iron with tears streaming down his weathered face. Other enslaved men was forced to help, cutting wood for the frame, fetching water to cool the metal, holding pieces steady while Solomon welded them together. They worked in terrible silence, broken only by the ring of hammer on anvil and the hiss of hot iron meeting water. Each strike felt like driving nails into their own coffins. Each piece fitted felt like building a monument to cruelty. Some men prayed under their breath, calling on Jesus, calling on the ancestors, begging forgiveness for their hands' participation in this evil. The box took shape through the night, a rectangular prison of iron bars and thick metal plates, with tiny holes drilled for air, but not enough to bring comfort, not enough to cool the heat that would build inside when the sun beat down. Solomon built a door with hinges that screamed like souls in torment, fitted a lock mechanism that would need a special key. He made it strong, made it inescapable, and with every piece he attached, he whispered, "Forgive me," to Annie, to God, to his own conscience. By the time the first light broke over the cotton fields, turning the sky from black to gray to pink, the firebox was finished. It sat in the punishment area near the quarters where everybody could see it, a monster of metal gleaming dull in the dawn, waiting hungry for its victim. Randall came to inspect it, walking around the box with his hands clasped behind his back, a satisfied smile on his face where Annie's nails had left scratches. "Perfect," he said, running his hand over the iron. "Absolutely perfect. Now bring her." They dragged Annie from the cabin where she'd spent her last night holding her children, kissing their foreheads, memorizing the feel of Josiah's arms around her. She'd barely slept, had spent the hours praying and reinforcing her spirit with every scrap of root knowledge and ancestral strength she possessed. She'd made Josiah promise to care for the children, made Sarah promise to be strong, made all of them promise to remember that what she was doing came from love, not from defeat. When they brought her to the box, the whole quarters was forced to watch. Randall wanted witnesses, wanted everybody to see what happened when you forgot your place. Annie stood before that metal coffin, and for a moment she faltered. Fear gripped her throat, made her legs weak. This was real. This was happening. 80 days in that box under the Alabama sun. Could anybody survive that? Could she? Then she thought of Sarah, thought of her children watching, thought of Nana Ephua who'd survived the Middle Passage, thought of every ancestor who'd endured the unendurable. She straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and walked toward the box on her own legs, not letting them drag her. If she was going into hell, She was walking in with dignity. "Any last words?" Randall asked mockingly. Annie turned, looked at him with eyes that held no fear, only certainty. "You can cage my body," she said loud enough for everybody to hear. "But my spirit flies free, and every day I'm in there I'll be praying for your soul, 'cause you gonna need it when judgment comes." Then she climbed into the box, laying down in that cramped metal space that smelled like iron and coal and sweat. The door closed with a clang that echoed like thunder. The lock clicked shut, and the sun began its slow climb into the sky, already promising heat that would turn that box into an oven, that would test Annie in ways no human should be tested. The construction was complete. The punishment had begun. And the quarters fell silent, everyone knowing they was witnessing something that would be remembered, that would be told and retold, that would become legend. The story of Annie and the firebox, the woman who refused to break. The first day Annie screamed, not from pain yet, but from the pure animal terror of being trapped, of feeling the walls pressing close, of realizing she couldn't stand up, couldn't turn over proper, couldn't do nothing but lay there in that iron prison. The sun climbed higher, and the metal started heating up, slow at first, then faster till the box became an oven baking her alive. Sweat poured from every inch of her skin, soaking her clothes, pooling beneath her. She could barely breathe through the tiny ventilation holes, each breath feeling like pulling hot air through a straw. "Help!" she screamed, banging her fists against the metal. "Somebody help me!" But nobody came, because nobody could. The quarters was back at work in the fields, forced to leave her behind, forced to hear her cries carrying on the wind, and pretend they didn't. Only the overseer stayed near, sitting in the shade with a jug of water, watching to make sure nobody tried to free her. By midday, the temperature inside that box must have been near unbearable, 100 degrees, maybe more. Annie's throat went raw from screaming, her voice cracking and failing. She prayed then, loud at first, calling on Jesus, on the ancestors, on Nana Ephua's spirit. "Please," she whispered through cracked lips, "please let me survive this. Let me see my children again. Give me strength." Toward evening, they opened the box just long enough to pour a cup of water through the ventilation holes. Most of it spilled, but Annie caught what she could with her mouth, desperate and grateful for even those few drops. Then the door clanged shut again, and the day's cooking finally eased as the sun set. But the night brought new torment, the cold creeping in, making her sweat-soaked clothes feel like ice against her skin, cramps seizing her muscles from laying still too long in that cramped space. The second day was worse. Her body was already weakened, dehydrated, aching in every joint. When the sun rose and the heat started building again, she wanted to scream but didn't have the voice left. She could hear the quarters waking up, hear her children's voices in the distance as they was taken to the fields, and it broke her heart fresh. Benjamin, the youngest, was crying for his mama. Sarah was trying to comfort him, her voice strained and scared. Josiah said nothing, but Annie could feel his anguish like a physical thing pressing against her chest. By the third day, the skin on her back where it pressed against the hot metal started to blister. Annie bit her lip till it bled to keep from screaming, not wanting to give Randall the satisfaction. She focused on small things to keep her mind from breaking, counting her breaths, remembering the words to spirituals, visualizing her children's faces one by one. She thought about Nana Ephua in the slave ship, surviving months in darkness and chains. She thought about all the ancestors who'd endured, who'd lived through horrors and came out the other side still human, still capable of love. "I'm still here," she whispered to herself, to them. "I'm still breathing. That means I'm winning." But by the fourth day, doubt crept in. Her lips was split and bleeding, her tongue swollen from thirst. The small amount of water they gave her wasn't enough, would never be enough. Her body was consuming itself, burning through whatever reserves she had. She started hallucinating, saw Nana Ephua standing outside the box, saw her mama Keturah reaching through the iron bars, saw cool rivers and shaded forests that disappeared when she tried to touch them. On the fifth day, Randall came to visit, kneeling beside the box so he could look through the ventilation holes. "How you feeling, Annie?" he asked, voice dripping with false concern. "You ready to apologize yet? Ready to admit your place? Annie gathered what moisture was left in her mouth and spit through the hole, aiming for his face. She missed, but the gesture said everything. Randall's expression darkened, and he stood up, brushing off his knees. "Stubborn," he said. "We'll see how stubborn you are after a few more weeks. We'll see if that spirit of yours can survive what's coming." He walked away, and Annie closed her eyes, praying for unconsciousness, for relief, for anything. But the day stretched on, eternal and unforgiving. By the 7th day, her voice was completely gone. She couldn't scream even if she wanted to. Could only lay there, cooking slow, feeling her body start to fail piece by piece, wondering if this was how it would end. Not with a bang or a fight, but with a slow fade into nothing, locked in an iron box under the merciless southern sun, forgotten by everyone except the God she hoped was still listening. Somewhere around the 10th day, Annie stopped knowing what was real and what wasn't. The heat and thirst and pain had blurred the line between this world and the next, and she found herself drifting between both, caught in a space where the ancestors walked close and the veil was thin as spider silk. She saw Nana Ephua clear as day, standing outside the box in full African dress, patterns bright and bold, head wrapped high and proud. The old woman wasn't smiling, but her eyes held something. Understanding maybe, or recognition. "Child," Nana Ephua said, voice sounding like it came from underwater. "You suffering something terrible." I can't do this," Annie whispered, though her lips barely moved. "It's too much, I'm dying." "Maybe," Nana said, kneeling down beside the box. "Or maybe you transforming. Sometimes dying and becoming look the same from the inside. You think I wanted to survive that ship? You think I didn't pray for death every day in that darkness? But I lived. And you gonna live too. Because we don't get to choose when our story ends. That's for the ancestors to decide." The vision shifted and Annie saw herself as a child again, running through the quarters with Sarah and her brothers, laughing without the weight of sorrow. She saw Josiah the night they jumped the broom, his face lit by firelight, his eyes full of hope that seemed impossible now. She saw her mama Ketura's hands braiding her hair, gentle and patient, humming a spiritual that Annie had forgotten the words to but still felt in her bones. Then the visions turned darker. She saw the middle passage, saw herself in the belly of a slave ship though she'd never been there, felt the chains cutting into wrists and ankles, heard the moaning of souls packed tight and dying slow. She understood then. This was ancestral memory, passed down through blood and spirit, showing her that what she was enduring wasn't new, wasn't unique. Her people had survived worse, had survived the ocean itself, and she carried that survival in her very DNA. "Listen to the drums," a voice said, and Annie realized she could hear them. Distant, rhythmic, speaking in patterns that language couldn't capture. The drums of Africa, carried across water and time, still beaten in the hearts of the diaspora. They told stories of resistance, of rebellions crushed and rebellions successful, of Nat Turner and Denmark Vesey and Harriet Tubman, of every enslaved person who'd chosen to fight rather than submit, who'd chosen death with dignity over life without it. Annie tried to move, tried to reach toward the sound, and agony shot through her body. The blisters on her back had burst and were festering, infection setting in. Her muscles, cramped for days in the same position, screamed with every tiny shift. But the drums kept beating, kept calling her to stay present, to stay alive. She focused on that rhythm. Let it become her heartbeat. Let it override the pain. On the 14th day, she attempted something desperate. In her more lucid moments, she'd been working one of the ventilation holes with her finger, trying to widen it, scratching at the metal till her fingernails broke and bled. It was futile. The iron was too strong, the hole too small. But she had to try something, had to do more than just lay there accepting her fate. She pushed and pulled and scratched, whispering prayers and curses in equal measure. "Open," she begged. "Please open." But the box held firm, unyielding as the system that had built it. The sun continued its merciless arc across the sky, heating the metal, cooking her slow. Annie's attempt at escape failed completely. leaving her more exhausted, more hopeless. She lay back panting, tears mixing with sweat, and for the first time truly considered giving up, considered stopping the fight and just letting go. No. The voice was firm, familiar. Annie opened her eyes and saw Keturah standing there, younger than she should be, stronger. No, baby, you don't get to quit. Not yet. Your story ain't finished. Mama, I'm so tired. I know. But tired ain't dead. And as long as you breathin', you resistin'. As long as your heart beatin', you winnin'. They want you to give up, want you to break so they can point and say, see? That's what happens when you forget your place. But you ain't forgot nothing. You remembered what it means to be human, to be a mother, to choose love over fear. That's the resistance they can't cage. The vision faded, leaving Annie alone again in the suffocating dark. But something had shifted. The drums was still beaten, the ancestors was still near and deep in her chest. That seed of resistance was still alive, still growing, still refusing to die. She wouldn't try to escape again, that was impossible. But she would survive. Day by day, breath by breath, she would outlast this hell and emerge on the other side. Changed forever, but not destroyed. I'm still here, she whispered to the box, to Randall, to the whole cruel system. I'm still here and you ain't killed me yet. Outside, the sun set on another day, and the quarters whispered prayers for Annie, begging God and the ancestors to give her strength for one more sunrise, one more sunset, one more heartbeat in that firebox that was meant to break her, but was forging her instead into something harder, something unbreakable. While Annie cooked slow in that iron coffin, life in the quarters moved forward like a river forcing its way around a stone, changed by the obstacle but still flowing. Josiah worked the fields like a man possessed, picking cotton till his fingers bled, carrying burdens twice his weight, pushing his body to the edge of collapse because if he stopped moving, if he let himself think too long about Annie trapped in that box, he'd lose his mind or try something foolish that would get him killed. At night, he gathered the children close in the cabin that felt too empty without Annie's presence. Sarah, 13 and carrying wounds no child should carry, had become the woman of the house by necessity. She cooked the meager meals, tended her brothers, tried to be strong even when her hands shook and her eyes filled with tears she wouldn't let fall. Benjamin and Moses, too young to fully understand, kept asking when Mama was coming home. And each time the question came, it tore fresh holes in Josiah's heart. Soon, he'd lie, holding them close. Mama coming home soon. But the days stretched into weeks, and rumors spread through the quarters like wildfire. Some said Annie was already dead, that they was just leaving her body in the box to make a point. Others swore they'd heard her voice on the wind, singing spirituals so soft only the faithful could hear. Keturah, Annie's mama, led prayer circles every night, gathering the women in her cabin to call on the ancestors, to send spiritual strength to her daughter however they could. They sang work songs with hidden meanings, codes that spoke of resistance and survival, messages they hoped would reach Annie through the walls of her prison. The men, meanwhile, started meeting in secret, voices kept low as they discussed options that ranged from desperate to suicidal. Josiah wanted to storm the box, break the lock, free his wife regardless of consequences. But Solomon the blacksmith, the one who'd been forced to build that torture device, held him back with hands still scarred from the forge. You free her, they kill you both, Solomon said, voice heavy with the weight of knowing. And they kill your children too, make examples of the whole family. That what you want? What I want is my wife back, Josiah's voice cracked. What I want is to not hear her suffering every time the wind blows right. What I want is impossible, Solomon finished gently. I know, but we gotta be smart. We gotta survive this, all of us, so that one day, maybe not today, maybe not next year, but one day, we can tell this story. We can remember what they did to Annie, and we can make sure it means something. By the 30th day, even the white folks was getting uncomfortable. The house servants whispered that Mrs. Wexford, Randall's pale wife from Savannah, had taken to her bed with nerves, couldn't sleep for hearing the sounds, real or imagined, coming from that box. Some of the field overseers, hard men who'd seen and done terrible things, started averting their eyes when they passed the punishment area, as if looking at the box might condemn their own souls. But Randall held firm, visiting the box every few days to check on his prisoner, to reassure himself that his authority was being maintained. He'd peer through the ventilation holes, ask Annie if she was ready to apologize, ready to admit he owned her completely, body, soul, and will. And every time, even when she was too weak to speak, Annie's silence was answer enough. She wouldn't break, couldn't break. The defiance in her eyes, visible even through her deterioration, enraged and unnerved him in equal measure. The quarters lived in suspension, caught between hope and despair. Children stopped playing as loud, laughter became rare. Even the spirituals sung in the fields took on darker tones, becoming laments more than promises. The whole plantation felt the weight of what was happening, felt the wrongness of it settling over everything like a shroud. Then on the 40th day, Randall made a decision that sent shockwaves through the community. He reduced Annie's water ration, ordering it cut from 1 cup a day to half a cup. The overseer who delivered the news looked sick about it, knowing that this was likely a death sentence, that no one could survive in that heat with so little water. But orders was orders, and in slavery, disobedience meant joining the punished. Keturah heard about the reduction and collapsed to her knees in the middle of the cotton field, wailing a sound that came from someplace primal, someplace beyond language. The other women surrounded her, holding her up, adding their voices to hers in a collective cry that rose to the heavens and demanded, if not justice, then at least witness. God had to see what was happening. The ancestors had to know. Somebody, somewhere, had to be paying attention to this atrocity. That night, the quarters didn't sleep. Folks gathered in small groups, praying, singing, remembering every story of survival they'd ever heard. They called on the memory of those who'd endured the Middle Passage, who'd survived the auction block, who'd outlasted whips and chains and countless attempts to break their spirits. They called on that collective strength, channeling it toward Annie, begging it to sustain her just a little longer. "She's still alive," someone whispered in the darkness. "I can feel it, she's still fighting." "How much longer?" another voice asked. "How much more can one woman take?" Nobody answered, because nobody knew. But in that silence, in that shared grief and hope and terror, something was being born. A understanding that Annie's suffering wasn't just her own, that it belonged to all of them, that her resistance was their resistance. When she finally emerged from that box, if she emerged, she wouldn't be just Annie anymore. She'd be a testament, a witness, a living proof that they system could torture our bodies but couldn't murder our souls. 40 days down, 40 more to go. And the question on everybody's mind, spoken and unspoken, was the same. Would Annie survive to see the box open, or would she join the countless others who'd been buried in unmarked graves, forgotten by history, but remembered by the people who loved them? The plantation held its breath and waited for the answer. By the 50th day, Annie's body was failing in ways that should have killed her already. Her skin, where it pressed constant against the heated metal, had burned through to raw flesh that wept and festered. The infection spread, turning her blood hot with fever, making her shake even in the brutal heat. Her lips was cracked so deep they couldn't close proper, her tongue thick as leather in her mouth. The half cup of water they gave her each day wasn't enough to wet her throat, let alone sustain life. She was dying slow, piece by piece, cell by cell, and she knew it. "Let me go," she whispered to God, to the ancestors, to anyone listening. "Please, just let me go. I can't do this no more." But even as she begged for release, even as her body screamed for the mercy of death, something in her refused to surrender. It was that seed Nana Ephua had planted so long ago, that core of resistance that ran deeper than flesh, deeper than bone. It was the knowledge that giving up now would mean Randall won, would mean her children would grow up thinking their mama broke, would mean the quarters would lose hope that anyone could withstand the master's cruelty. "No," she whispered through ruined lips. "No, no, no." On the 55th day, she thought she heard her children singing. The sound came faint through the ventilation holes, carried on the evening breeze. Voices young and scared but determined, singing a spiritual Annie had taught them when they was small. The words spoke of crossing over to the promised land, of laying down burdens, of freedom coming one day. Sarah was leading, her voice stronger than it should be after what she'd endured. The boys joined in, off-key but earnest, and the sound of them together broke something in Annie and mended it at the same time. "Mama can hear you," she wanted to shout. "Mama's still here." But her voice was gone, burned away by heat and thirst and screaming. She could only lay there and listen, tears leaking from her eyes, mixing with the sweat and blood. The children sang 3 spirituals, then stopped, probably forced back to the cabin by the overseer. But the sound of their voices stayed with Annie, echoed in her head, became a lifeline she could grip when everything else was slipping away. That night, she had a vision clearer than any before. She saw herself from above, saw her body in that box, skeletal, burned, broken but not dead. She saw her spirit hovering above, connected by the thinnest thread, and she understood she was at a crossroads, standing between this world and the next. One more push toward death and the thread would snap. But if she chose to stay, chose to endure, that thread would strengthen, would pull her back. "What do you choose?" a voice asked. Nana Ephua's voice, or maybe her own. Annie looked at the broken body in the box, then looked toward a light that promised peace, promised rest, promised an end to suffering. It would be so easy to go toward that light, to let the ancestors welcome her home. But then she thought of Sarah's voice leading that spiritual, thought of Josiah holding they sons, thought of Keturah praying every night, thought of the whole quarters waiting to see if she'd survive, if resistance was possible, if one woman's refusal to break could mean something bigger than herself. "I choose to stay," Annie said, and the thread pulsed bright and strong. She slammed back into her body with such force it felt like drowning in reverse. Pulled from water into air, choking and gasping. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, worse than before because now she was fully present in it, no longer hovering at the edge. But she was alive, undeniably alive, and that meant she still had purpose, still had fight, still had a story to tell when this was over. The 60th day came and went, then the 65th. Annie stopped counting, stopped tracking time, just focused on breathing in and out, on lasting one more hour, one more minute, one more heartbeat. Her body adapted in ways that shouldn't be possible. Learned to survive on almost no water. Learned to endure temperatures that should have cooked her organs. Learned to fight infection with nothing but willpower and whatever ancestral knowledge flowed through her blood. Randall visited less often now, unnerved by what he saw through them ventilation holes. The woman in the box didn't look human anymore. Looked like something the grave had rejected, something caught between life and death. But her eyes, Lord, her eyes still burned with that defiant fire, still held onto humanity when the body was barely recognizable. It scared him in ways he couldn't name, made him wonder if he'd created something worse than punishment, if he'd forged a martyr instead of broken a slave. "Just die already," he muttered on one visit, though whether he was talking to Annie or himself, nobody knew. But Annie wouldn't die, couldn't die, not yet. She'd reached the point of breaking and passed through it into something else, something tempered by fire, hardened by suffering, made unbreakable by the choice to endure. The quarters watched in awe and horror, and they started to believe. If Annie could survive this, maybe they could survive anything. Maybe freedom wasn't just a dream whispered in hush harbors. Maybe it was coming, sure and certain as the dawn. Time became meaningless in the box, stretching and contracting like something alive and cruel. Annie existed in a state between waking and sleeping, between living and dying, where minutes felt like hours and hours disappeared in blinks. The sun rose and set, a rhythm she tracked more by the temperature changes than by sight. Burning days followed by freezing nights, an endless cycle of torture that her body learned to endure the way water learns to flow around stones. The 70th day arrived without fanfare. Randall came to inspect his prisoner, bringing old Harlan Wexford with him this time. The elder master, weathered and cruel in his own right, looked at what remained of Annie and shook his head slow, troubled in ways that didn't often touch plantation owners. "Son," he said quiet, "this might have gone too far. Woman looks more ghost than human. If she dies in there, we'll have trouble with the others. They already working slow, sabotaging equipment. I found 3 plow blades broken yesterday. Ain't no accident." "She brought this on herself," Randall insisted, but his voice held less certainty than before. "Struck a white man, drew blood. Can't let that stand." "Nobody's saying let it stand," Harlan replied. "But 80 days? That's—" He trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish the thought. Even he, who'd built his fortune on the backs of enslaved people, who'd ordered countless whippings and separations and cruelties, found something uncomfortable about this particular punishment. It was too visible, too prolonged, too much like torture for torture's sake rather than discipline for profit. Inside the box, Annie barely registered their voices. She'd transcended language days ago, existed now in a space of pure sensation, heat, cold, pain, thirst, breath. The spiritual songs that had sustained her earlier had faded to wordless hums that rose and fell with her breathing. She was animal and saint at once, reduced to basic survival while simultaneously touched by something divine that kept her heart beating against all logic. The quarters, meanwhile, had begun to change. The slow work Harlan noticed wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. Organized resistance led quietly by Josiah and the other men. They broke tools accidentally, worked slower, feigned illness, found 1,000 small ways to disrupt the plantation's efficiency. It was dangerous, could result in whippings or worse, but Annie's suffering had ignited something that couldn't be extinguished. A collective rage that demanded expression, a shared understanding that they was all in that box together in spirit, if not in body. The women joined the resistance in their own ways. Keturah and the elder mothers led prayer circles that grew larger every night, gatherings that the overseers couldn't quite justify breaking up, because what harm was there in slaves praying? But them prayers was more than requests to God. They was affirmations of humanity, declarations that suffering wouldn't break them, promises that memory would outlast cruelty. The women sang spirituals with hidden meanings, passed messages through work songs, created a network of support and resistance that flowed through the quarters like underground water. By the 75th day, even the house servants was involved. They started spilling food, accidentally, overcooking meals, breaking dishes. Mrs. Wexford complained constantly about the incompetence, not realizing it was intentional, not understanding that Annie's punishment had unified the enslaved people in ways no rebellion leader could have. They wasn't organizing an escape or planning violence. They was simply refusing to be efficient, refusing to make their own bondage comfortable for the masters, refusing to pretend everything was normal while one of their own cooked alive in an iron box. On the 78th day, Randall made his final visit before the scheduled release. He brought a preacher with him, a white man who claimed to speak for God, who looked at Annie and immediately stepped back, face pale. This is unholy," the preacher whispered. "Mr. Wexford, what you've done here is within my rights," Randall interrupted sharply. "She's my property. The law says—" "I know what the law says," the preacher cut him off, unusual boldness in his voice. "But God's law is higher, and this—" He gestured at the box, at the shell of a woman inside it. "This is an abomination. You've created a martyr, sir. Look at what's happening on your plantation. The unrest, the resistance. You wanted to break one woman and you've strengthened everyone else." Randall's face flushed red, but he couldn't deny the truth. The plantation was barely functioning, held together by threat of violence but crumbling from within. The other plantations was hearing about Annie, about the firebox, about the woman who wouldn't break, and Masters was getting nervous, wondering if their own slaves might start getting ideas about resistance. 2 more days, Randall said through gritted teeth. Then she comes out. Dead or alive, the punishment ends. Inside the box, Annie heard nothing of this conversation, knew nothing about the resistance she'd inspired. understood nothing except that she was still breathing, still existing, still holding onto that thread that connected her to life. 78 days down, 2 more to go. The end was coming, whether she survived to see it or not. The 79th day dawned gray and heavy, clouds gathering thick like the sky itself was mourning. The whole plantation felt it. Something was about to break, about to change, about to end. Folks moved through their work slow and silent, eyes constantly drifting toward the punishment area where that iron box sat, where Annie had been locked for nearly 3 months, where life and death had been battling over one woman's soul. Randall woke that morning with a certainty in his gut. Annie was dead. Had to be. Nobody could survive 80 days in that heat with so little water, with flesh burned and infected, with a body pushed beyond every human limit. He'd checked on her 2 days prior, and she'd looked more corpse than woman. Eyes sunken deep, skin stretched tight over bones that showed through like they was trying to escape. Today would be the day he'd open the box and drag out a body, would bury the evidence of his cruelty in some unmarked spot, and tell everyone she'd died of natural causes brought on by her own defiance. He walked to the punishment area with the overseer and several field hands, men chosen to dispose of the body. Once it was confirmed she was gone, the whole quarters watched from a distance, forced to work but unable to focus on anything except that moment when the lock would turn, when the door would open, when they'd finally know if Annie had survived the unsurvivable. Josiah stood in the cotton field, hands frozen on a half-picked bowl, chest tight with dread and desperate hope. His children clustered around Keturah, who held them close and prayed under her breath in languages that predated slavery. Sarah was crying silent tears, mourning a mother she was certain she'd never see alive again. The whole community held its breath as one, united in grief and anticipation. Randall reached the box, pulled the key from his pocket, and paused. For the first time in 80 days, something like doubt crossed his face. What if she was still alive? What if she'd actually survived? What would that mean? But he pushed the thought away, fit the key in the lock, and turned it. The mechanism clicked loud in the morning silence, and the door swung open with a groan of metal that sounded like souls releasing. The smell hit first. Death and decay and human waste and infection. A stench so powerful men covered their faces and stepped back. The overseer pulled a handkerchief over his nose and peered into the box, expecting to see a corpse. What he saw instead made him stumble backward, eyes wide with shock. "Sweet Jesus," he whispered. "She's breathing." Impossible. That's what everybody thought. Impossible, unbelievable, unholy. But there she was. Annie, barely recognizable as human, skin burned black and red and weeping, body skeletal and twisted from months of cramping in that small space, eyes sunken so deep they looked like holes, lips cracked and bleeding. But her chest was moving, shallow and labored, rising and falling with breaths that should have stopped weeks ago. Randall stared, face draining of color. He'd wanted to break her, wanted to prove his absolute power, wanted to make her an example that would keep the other slaves in line forever. Instead, he'd created something terrifying. A woman who'd endured hell itself and refused to die. A testament to resistance that would haunt him and inspire others for generations. Annie's eyes opened, those hollow eyes that had seen beyond the veil and chosen to come back. She looked directly at Randall, and though her voice was barely a whisper, barely more than breath across ruined vocal cords, the words she spoke carried weight that silence never could. "You didn't kill me." 5 words. That's all she managed. But they contained everything: defiance, victory, prophecy. They said, "I survived your worst, and I'm still here." They said, "You have power over my body but not my spirit." They said, "This will be remembered and you will be judged. If not in this life, then in the next." Randall's hand went to his chest like he'd been struck. He stepped back, then back again, unable to hold Annie's gaze, unable to process what he was seeing. The field hands moved forward, careful, reaching into the box to lift her out. Her body was light as a child's, All muscle and flesh burned away, leaving only bone and determination. When they laid her on the ground, she couldn't stand. Her legs wouldn't support her weight after so long cramped in one position. But she was conscious, aware, alive. "Get her to the quarters," the overseer said quietly, voice shaken. "Get Keturah. Get the women who know healing." They carried Annie on a makeshift stretcher, moving slow through the field as word spread like wildfire. She survived. Annie survived. Impossible, miraculous, terrifying. She survived. Josiah broke from his work, running toward them despite the overseer's shouts, dropping to his knees beside the stretcher to take his wife's hand, weeping openly without shame. "I'm here," he sobbed. "I'm here, love. You made it. You made it." Annie's fingers twitched in his grip, the barest squeeze, acknowledgement that she heard him, that she knew him, that whatever had happened in that box hadn't destroyed her mind along with her body. Keturah came running, face streaked with tears, falling beside her daughter and beginning immediately to assess the damage, to plan the healing, to call on every bit of root knowledge passed down through generations. The quarters erupted in sound, crying, praising, singing, shouting. The resistance that had been simmering broke into open celebration. Slaves dropping their tools to run toward Annie, to witness the miracle, to see proof that the human spirit could endure what the body could not. The overseers didn't even try to stop them, too shaken themselves by what they'd witnessed. And Randall, he stood alone by the empty firebox, staring at his hands like they belonged to someone else, understanding for the first time that he'd lost something fundamental in this exchange. He'd wanted to prove his power, and had instead revealed its limits. Annie's survival would become legend, would spread from plantation to plantation, would inspire resistance in ways no rebellion leader ever could. He'd tried to create an example of submission, and had forged an icon of endurance instead. The 80 days was over. Annie had survived, and nothing on Wexford Plantation, or in the broader South, would ever be quite the same. Healing came slow, slower than anyone expected, and it came twisted. Annie's body tried to mend itself, but the damage was too severe, too deep, had lasted too long. Keturah and the other root women worked on her day and night, applying poultices made from comfrey and plantain, brewing teas from willow bark and ginger, washing the infected wounds with solutions that stung fierce but fought the rot that had set in. They sang over her, prayed over her, called on the ancestors to guide their hands and give Annie strength to endure this new kind of suffering. The agony of a body trying to remember how to be alive. The first week out of the box, Annie couldn't walk. Her legs, cramped for 80 days in the same bent position, had forgotten their purpose. The muscles had atrophied, the joints had seized, and when Josiah tried to help her stand, she collapsed immediate, crying out in pain that made everyone in the cabin wince. So they worked on her gentle, massaging her legs with oils infused with cayenne and rosemary, moving her joints slow through their range of motion, helping her remember what it meant to have a body that could move. Her back, where the burned skin had pressed against hot metal for months, healed wrong. The flesh knit together in thick raised scars that pulled and twisted, leaving her permanently bent forward, unable to stand fully upright ever again. She looked like an old woman, though she wasn't yet 30, spine curved, shoulders hunched, moving with the shuffle of someone decades older. But she was alive, and that's what mattered. That's what everyone kept saying. "You alive, Annie. You made it. You won." The infection in her wounds took longest to heal. Keturah had to drain abscesses that had formed deep in the tissue, had to cut away dead flesh that wouldn't come back to life, had to pack the wounds with honey and garlic and prayers. Annie bore it all without complaint, barely making sound even when the pain must have been unbearable. She'd learned in that box how to separate herself from suffering, how to exist in a place beyond the body's screaming, and she carried that knowledge with her now. But the worst damage wasn't physical. Annie woke screaming most nights, trapped again in dreams where the box closed around her, where the heat built and built with no release, where she died over and over in that iron coffin, only to wake up still imprisoned. Josiah held her through them episodes, rocking her like a child, whispering that she was safe, she was home. The box was empty, and she'd never go back. Sometimes she believed him, sometimes she didn't. Still, as the weeks passed, Annie grew stronger. She started walking short distances with help, then longer distances with a cane Josiah carved for her. She started taking food again, though her stomach had shrunk and she could only eat small amounts. She started talking more, her voice still raspy and damaged but functional. Able to tell stories, able to teach her children, able to do what she'd always done. Pass on knowledge, preserve memory, keep the flame of resistance burning. And Lord, did she have stories to tell now? The whole quarters came to hear her, gathering in the evening when work was done, sitting at her feet while she recounted the 80 days. She told them about the visions, about Nana Ephua, and the ancestors keeping her alive, about the choice she made to endure, about the spiritual battle that happened in that box between submission and resistance. She told them the truth without softening it. The box nearly killed her, did kill parts of her, but couldn't touch the core of who she was. They can cage the body, she said, voice rough but certain. But the spirit flies free. Never forget that. Never let them make you forget. Her children listened most closely. Sarah, still healing from her own violation, drew strength from her mama's survival. If Annie could endure the firebox, then Sarah could endure the aftermath of rape. If Annie could refuse to break, then Sarah could refuse to let shame define her. The boys, Samuel, Benjamin, and Moses, absorbed lessons about manhood that no overseer's whip could teach. Real strength wasn't about physical power or dominance, it was about enduring, protecting, choosing resistance, even when submission seemed easier. Josiah, though, struggled. He'd spent 80 days helpless, watching his wife suffer and being able to do nothing. The guilt ate at him even as he rejoiced in her survival. "I should have done something," he'd say late at night when they was alone. "Should have broken you out, should have fought Randall, should have gotten yourself killed," Annie would interrupt, touching his face gentle. "And left our children orphans. No, love, you did what you needed to do. You survived. You kept them safe." That's the resistance that matters. Staying alive, staying together, refusing to let them destroy us completely. News of Annie's survival spread beyond Wexford Plantation, carried by the grapevine that connected enslaved communities across the South. Other plantations heard about the woman who spent 80 days in the firebox and lived, and the story grew with each telling, becoming legend. Some masters heard it and felt fear, understanding that torture had limits, that pushing too far could create martyrs instead of submission. Some slaves heard it and felt hope, understanding that endurance was possible, that the human spirit had depths of strength they hadn't known existed. Randall heard the whispers, heard his name spoken with hatred and fear, and withdrew into the big house, drinking more, sleeping less, haunted by what he'd done and what it had created. His wife left him, unable to bear the reputation that now clung to the Wexford name. His father regarded him with disappointment and barely concealed disgust. He'd wanted to prove his power and had instead become a cautionary tale, a symbol of cruelty's ultimate failure. As for Annie, she lived, bent and scarred, voice damaged, nightmares frequent, body forever marked by 80 days of hell. But alive. She lived to see her children grow strong, lived to tell her story, lived to plant seeds of resistance that would grow and flower in ways she couldn't predict. She lived, and in living, she won. Not the way stories usually end, not with triumph or freedom or justice, but with survival, with memory preserved, with dignity maintained against all odds. And that, children, that's the victory that matters most. Not the victories that make history books, but the quiet victories of endurance, of choosing to keep breathing when everything says stop, of refusing to let cruelty define you. Annie taught us that. Annie showed us that. And as long as we remember her story, as long as we tell it true, she keeps winning, keeps resisting, keeps proving that the fire meant to consume us, sometimes tempers us instead into something unbreakable. Years passed, and Annie grew old before her time. that bent spine and scarred flesh marking her as someone who'd been through fire and survived. She became an elder in the quarters, a living testament to endurance, a keeper of memories that couldn't be allowed to fade. Children gathered at her feet to hear stories of the old ways, of Africa and ancestors, of resistance and survival. She taught them root work and conjure, passed down the knowledge Nana Ephua had given her, made sure that even in bondage, they remembered they came from greatness, from kingdoms and warriors and wisdom older than slavery itself. Then came 1865, and with it the war's end, the news spreading slow through the South like dawn breaking after the longest night. Freedom. The word tasted strange on tongues that had never been allowed to speak it without punishment. The Union soldiers came, reading proclamations, and the quarters erupted in celebration, crying, singing, dancing, praising God and the ancestors who'd sustained them through centuries of suffering. Annie stood in the middle of it all, leaning heavy on her cane, watching her grown children rejoice. Sarah had become a teacher, determined to help freed people learn to read and write. Samuel and Benjamin worked their own land now, refusing to pick cotton for anyone but themselves. Moses had joined the Union Army, fighting for the freedom that had finally come. Josiah stood beside Annie, older too, but still strong, still devoted, still the man who'd held her through nightmares and celebrated her survival. "We made it," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "We actually made it." Annie nodded, unable to speak past the emotion closing her throat. She thought of Nana Ephua, of Keturah, who'd passed 2 years prior, of all the ones who hadn't lived to see this day. She thought of the firebox, that iron coffin that had tried to break her but had forged her instead into something testimony could be built on. She thought of the 80 days that had tested her beyond human limits and taught her that the spirit, when anchored in love and resistance and ancestral strength, could endure anything. That evening, as the celebration continued, Annie gathered the children, hers and others, the young ones who'd been born into freedom and the old ones who'd survived to see it. And she told them one last time about the firebox, about the choice to endure, about the price of resistance and its rewards. She told them that freedom wasn't the end of the story, but the beginning, that the work of healing and building and remembering was just starting, that they had to carry the memory forward so future generations would know what it cost to get here. "The fire they used to try to consume us," she said, voice rough but powerful. "That same fire lights our path forward. Every scar, every story, every ancestor who held on. They're all part of the light that guides us now. We survived because we refused to let the flame die, even when they tried to snuff it out. And now we pass that flame to you, to your children, to the generations coming. Keep it burning. Keep telling the truth. Keep resistance alive in your hearts." She stood then, despite the pain, despite the bent spine, stood as straight as she could manage and looked at all the faces surrounding her. Faces no longer marked by ownership. Faces free to express joy and sorrow and anger and hope without permission. And in that moment, Annie understood that the 80 days hadn't broken her because they couldn't break what was already eternal. The human desire for dignity, for agency, for love unbound by chains. The sun set over Wexford Plantation, no longer a prison but a place people could choose to leave or stay. And as darkness fell and the first stars appeared, Annie thought she heard it. The drums of Africa, the songs of the ancestors, the voices of all who'd suffered and endured, all rising together in a chorus that said, "We survived, we remember, we won. The old ones warned us. Them that suffered, suffered. Them that resisted, left memory behind. And memory, child, memory lives on when everything else turns to dust. What happened to Annie in that firebox, what she endured and how she survived, that ain't just her story. That's our story. All of us who descended from folks who crossed that dark water, who stood on auction blocks, who picked cotton under killing sun, who loved and fought and held on when letting go seemed easier. Annie showed us the way. You can torture a body, but you can't murder a spirit that refuses to die. That knowledge lives on here, in these tellings, in these memories we guard like sacred flame. So you carry this story forward now, you hear? Carry it with the weight it deserves, with the truth it demands. 'Cause the ones who came before, they counting on us to remember. And we do. Lord knows we do. Their voices still echo, still testify, still call us to resistance and survival. Here, always here, in the echoes from the quarters.